This story is about how witnesses vanish, leaving hunters with nothing but broken gear, and the truth remains buried by those who refuse to believe. In the remote corners of the wilderness, from quiet RV campgrounds to dense forest thickets, something ancient and terrifying is awakening. These blood-curdling encounters with a mysterious creature leave behind only fear, confusion, and unanswered questions. The RV campground was located in the wilderness of southern Oregon, not far from Grants Pass. It was a quiet, forest-surrounded spot that usually attracted retirees and weary travelers. In my research, I found that on April 22, 2025, it turned into something completely different. That night, something emerged from the woods, something huge and ferocious. As a result, 2 people were killed and dozens were injured. One girl, 16-year-old Kayla Mendez, survived by hiding in a concrete restroom at the campground. Her testimony was the only lead the authorities had because whatever had swept through the RV campground wasn't supposed to exist. The day had started as usual. Families were grilling hot dogs, and retirees were sitting outside their trailers, sharing stories and watching the sunset filter through the tall pine trees. Kayla had come with her aunt and uncle from Redding and was staying in a borrowed Class C motorhome. Shortly before midnight, she went to brush her teeth in the park's public restrooms. That short detour saved her life. After that, everything happened very quickly. At 12:17 a.m., the campground's main power supply went out. The sudden darkness woke several guests, and some stepped out of their RVs to check the fuses. A muffled crunch sounded in the darkness among the trees. Heavy footsteps, too steady and powerful for any known animal, shook the ground. Then came the first scream, a man's voice, cut off mid-word. The scream was sharp and brief, followed by a screech and the clang of crumpling metal. Kayla, frozen with terror, pressed herself against the bathroom wall. Outside, the air filled with the sounds of wood snapping and aluminum tearing. The trailer, just 30 feet away from her, was being torn to pieces as if it were made of paper. More screams rang out, this time from women, and something answered with a roar, a deep guttural growl that made her chest tremble through the wall. It wasn't a bear. They don't scream like that, they don't walk on 2 legs, and they don't punch through steel with their fists. Outside, Jerry and Linda Hopkins, a married couple, had run out of their RV after hearing the power go out. They never returned. Their trailer was found the next morning, crushed from the inside. As it turned out, both victims were battered, torn apart, and covered in blood. The roof had been torn off, and deep claw marks ran along the side walls, spaced too far apart from one another. Investigators classified it as a probable black bear attack, although in private conversations, rescue workers admitted that the damage seemed unreal. Kayla hid for nearly 20 minutes, clutching a toilet paper holder in the pitch-black darkness while something circled the building. Heavy footsteps, slow breathing, and occasional growls kept her silent. When the noise finally stopped, she waited another 10 minutes before crawling outside. According to her, her legs were shaking so badly that she could barely run. Chaos reigned in the RV park. 2 trailers had been destroyed, a third was half crushed, and claw marks were visible on its windows. The vacationers had lost their shoes, bags, and even their pets. Someone had left a trail of blood leading from the main entrance to the central lawn. An elderly man suffered a heart attack while trying to escape. Others abandoned their RVs altogether, jumping into their cars and driving off without their headlights on. I learned that Josephine County Sheriff's deputies were the first to arrive at the scene. By dawn, representatives from the Oregon Department of Fish and Wildlife had arrived. They attributed the incident to the presence of a large, aggressive bear, possibly suffering from rabies. They mentioned the spring food shortage and the animal's unusual behavior due to the early heat. However, no one really believed them, especially after seeing the tracks. Kayla, still in shock, pointed to the spot where she thought it had been standing. There, in the shade of the trees near the restrooms, were 5 deep footprints, each nearly 20 inches long, indented into the soil by almost 2 inches. No claw marks on the toes, no paw print shape. These were not bear tracks. They were shaped like human footprints, but they were enormous. The police photographed them but said nothing more about it afterward. They did not make any plaster casts. The next day, a bulldozer cleared the area. The entire park was closed for repairs and the investigation. By the end of the week, most of the trailers had been evacuated or destroyed. I was shocked to learn that some vacationers were offered money to keep quiet. Rumors spread online. However, without photographs, video footage, or confirmed statements, interest gradually faded. The incident was shelved, as I later learned. The Hopkins deaths were officially ruled a tragic but natural attack by a wild animal. Their daughter tried to push for a further investigation, but no one would listen to her. She returned home and barely spoke. When asked, she said it was neither a bear nor a human, but something in between, taller than the doorway, covered in black fur, with glowing eyes. She saw it only through the cracks in the door. Investigators noted the strength required to crush the RV and acknowledged that no known species of bear was capable of such a feat, but their conclusion remained the same. They claimed it was a rare and isolated incident. But some residents of the area had heard stories before about screams in the forest, missing hunters, and tracks leading nowhere. In the documents, I saw that one of the residents who had helped at the scene later told a friend that this wasn't the first time he'd seen something like that. He claimed that the authorities always blamed bears, but he knew the truth. To this day, the RV campground remains closed to visitors. The site is now privately owned and fenced off with no trespassing signs. No charges were ever filed. The photographs were never published. Only one survivor spoke out, but she eventually fell silent. The most surprising thing is that no one knows for sure what emerged from the woods that night and left behind a trail of twisted steel, torn flesh, and the ragged breathing of a teenager who still wakes up screaming to this day. Derek Lawson and Brian Yates were experienced hikers and frequent visitors to the wilderness around their town. On March 9, 2025, they set out on a planned 3-day hike in the northeastern sector of the park, far from the tourist trails, but never returned. 4 days later, park rangers discovered their car parked at the trailhead. It was untouched, with the keys still inside. Search and rescue teams combed the area, but snowfall and strong winds made the work nearly impossible. Nearly 2 weeks passed with no results, no signal, no gear, and no tracks. However, after the thaw, Derek's remains were found in a shallow ravine, half covered by bushes, surrounded by fallen trees and strange tracks. What exactly happened to the men was never determined. In the official report I found, the blame was placed on a puma, but the wounds didn't match that explanation, nor did the shattered bones, missing limbs, and giant tracks nearby. Some said the truth had been covered up, while others believed that something truly terrifying was roaming the woods. As I mentioned earlier, by that morning, Derek and Brian had already made dozens of trips through the wilderness. They took lightweight snowshoes, an emergency supply of provisions, and freeze-dried food with them, and headed for a rarely used trail known for its views of moose and frozen waterfalls. The route was remote, no cell service, no shelter, and barely visible trail markers. But the two of them felt right at home in the solitude. They were ready. The weather changed faster than expected. The temperature dropped, and the wind began to pick up. On the second night, something went wrong. According to GPS data I found in the case files from Derek's fitness watch, both had returned to camp after sunset. The next signal came 3 hours later, half a mile down the slope. The signal moved erratically and then disappeared completely. The search party found Brian's gear scattered across the slope, some of it torn to shreds. His backpack was torn in half, and his hunting knife was found snapped in two under a moss-covered rock. His body was never found. The situation with Derek's body is different. Found in early April, it was covered with numerous wounds. Medical experts determined that his ribs had been crushed inward, and his spine neatly snapped in half. His face was intact, his eyes wide open, and his lips torn from screaming. Deep wounds ran across his chest and thighs, but they were not neat. They were blunt, wide, and by all appearances inflicted by enormous fingers or claws. His arms were broken at the elbows. One boot was still on his foot, the other lay 50 feet away, hanging from a tree branch 15 feet above the ground. Footprints were found near the scene, but not from boots. They were from bare feet. Four-toed, nearly 20 inches long, they were imprinted in the mud nearly 3 inches deep. Too deep to be human, too distinct to be a bear's. They surrounded the body and disappeared into the dense pine forest. Forest rangers photographed them but never released the photos, and one of the volunteer search and rescue workers admitted that the next day they smoothed over the tracks and covered them with dirt using shovels. I learned that the case had been officially closed in early May. The cause of death was listed as blunt force trauma, consistent with an attack by a large predator. Authorities stated that the men were likely attacked by a puma while they were sleeping. They declined to comment on the missing gear, the fallen trees, or the barefoot tracks. Hunters in the area had been discussing strange sightings for many years, huge silhouettes among the trees and sounds that shouldn't have been there. One man claimed to have seen something dragging a deer carcass by one leg near the same trail where the hikers disappeared. Another woman reported that a week before the search began, something with hands had been knocking on the door of her cabin. The authorities' final account was vague. The press release mentioned a rare and unfortunate encounter with an agitated animal, possibly a bear or a puma. But there were no active bears in the region at that time of year. Moreover, the bite marks did not match any known species. The forensic examination raised even more questions. Derek's wounds were not typical scratches or bites. They looked like crush marks, as if he had been grabbed by something with hands too large to belong to a human. There were also bruises on his shoulders shaped like long fingers. His backpack was found several miles from the scene, torn down the middle like a sheet of paper. The GPS navigator inside recorded a sudden surge covering more than 30 yards in less than 4 seconds. Then it shut off. The photos from their phones were never found. Both devices were missing when the bodies were discovered. Some speculated that they had been stolen. Others said that perhaps they had tried to use them as a light source or a means of self-defense. In any case, there are no video recordings or photographs of the attack. All that remains is the crime scene and evidence that investigators chose not to explain. As far as I know, the Park Service denied rumors of an internal report. Nevertheless, rumors spread among search and rescue teams. This story became an unspoken warning. Tourists were advised to leave the trail before dark and to always pay close attention to their surroundings. Derek's parents refused to accept the official account of the cause of death. They hired a private investigator who visited the scene a few weeks later. He reported finding twisted young trees, broken branches, and stripped bark, all at chest height, well above what a bear could reach. He saw no wildlife droppings, no predator tracks, nothing, only silence, heavy and suffocating. Eventually, the park closed the trail where Derek and Brian had disappeared. Officially, this was due to the unstable terrain and the risk of encounters with wild animals. Unofficially, however, the rangers stopped going there at night. Now, instead of foot patrols, helicopters patrol this sector from the air. Brian's body has still not been found. For me, and I'm not alone, the fate of these men remains a mystery to this day. Something powerful was hunting them in the dark. Something that left no traces behind except fear, mutilated bodies, and stories too strange to tell out loud. The Collier family had owned their secluded cabin in the California wilderness for over 20 years. It stood on a 5-acre plot of dense forest, a 2-hour drive from the nearest town. It had been a quiet, peaceful refuge until March 2nd, 2025, a day the family would never forget. Darren Collier was a 43-year-old construction foreman. His wife, Mia, 39, worked as a veterinary assistant. Their 2 children, 9-year-old Lily and 13-year-old Tyler, had been visiting the cabin since they were very young. There was no electricity, no cell service, and no neighbors, just an old tree, propane, lanterns, and silence. According to my information, the family arrived on Friday afternoon, hoping to spend a quiet weekend in the mountains. At first, everything seemed normal. They unpacked their things, built a fire, and made dinner. The first sign that something was wrong appeared that night around 2 o'clock. Tyler heard heavy footsteps around the cabin. In the morning, he told his father about it, but Darren thought it was just a deer. However, around the perimeter, they discovered a trail of disturbed leaves and pine needles. Strangely, there were no hoof prints, only long, barefoot footprints spaced too far apart to belong to a human. On the second night, the situation came to a head. After dinner, the family sat by the campfire, listening to the wind. Then there was a knock, a single sharp thud against the back wall of the cabin. Darren grabbed a flashlight and ran outside, but there was no one there, only shadows and trees. But 10 minutes later, the knock repeated, this time coming from the roof. Panic began to set in. They heard something moving across the roof. Slowly, steadily, heavily. It wasn't a raccoon or a squirrel. It was something heavy, like a person. Darren ran out again with his rifle, circled the cabin, his heart pounding. And again, nothing. A third knock sounded at the front door. Not a scratch or a shove, but a knock, as if with a fist. Then Mia gathered the children in the corner and locked the door. With trembling hands, Darren closed the windows. The knocking stopped. Silence reigned in the forest outside the windows. Then a roar rang out. Low and drawn out, it was neither a cougar nor a bear. It was a deep rumble, too powerful to belong to anything they knew. The family sat in complete silence, too frightened to speak or move. The roar grew louder. Then something slammed into the cabin with full force. The wall shook and dust rained down from the ceiling. Tyler screamed. The light flickered as the propane lantern tipped over. Darren rushed to catch it before it shattered, but a second blow knocked him off his feet. What I read next left me in shock. This time, the front window of the cabin exploded inward, glass and wood flying in all directions as something dark and massive burst through it. Lily was pulled aside at the last moment. She said she saw fingers, long black fingers, similar to human ones but much too large, covered in thick, dirty fur. They clung to the edge of the shattered window and braced themselves, testing the frame's strength. Then a roar rang out, so loud it shattered the silence of the night. Darren fired at the window. Mom's hand jerked back and vanished. Silence reigned once more, except for the distant heavy footsteps receding into the forest. The family didn't sleep. At dawn, they packed up all their belongings in a matter of minutes. Darren left the cabin door wide open as they sped down the dirt road in their pickup truck. Mia glanced in the rearview mirror. Something was standing at the edge of the forest, watching them. 8 feet tall, with broad shoulders, no visible face, just dark fur and arms longer than a human's. They drove straight to the nearest forest ranger station. The rangers listened to them, but their expressions changed when Darren mentioned the knocking and growling and showed them photos of the damage. Shattered window frames, deep scratches on the door, a 15-foot trail of blood on the siding. They fell silent. In the official report I found, compiled 2 days later, they called it a bear attack. They said the bear was likely disturbed by the presence of people during its early spring awakening. They said it had probably stood on its hind legs and surveyed the cabin from the outside in search of food, but no bear on record had ever knocked on a door. No bear had ever smashed a window or growled like that, and no bear had ever walked away on 2 legs. A week later, the family returned, accompanied by forest rangers, to retrieve their remaining belongings. The scene of destruction turned out to be worse than they remembered. The roof had partially collapsed. On one of the exterior walls, 9 feet up, was a long vertical scratch. 4 deep lines resembling fingerprints. Blood, already dried, left stains on the porch. It didn't belong to any of them. The tracks were never found, at least not officially. But Tyler caught a glimpse of them in a patch of soft ground behind the cabin. He pointed them out to the forester, who quickly raked them away and said they were just the result of the wind. Tyler didn't argue, but he remembered it. 3 months later, the Callers sold the cabin. The new owner tried to restore it but gave up, claiming that every night someone or something was throwing rocks at the construction site. Locals avoid that area. Longtime residents say they've known for decades that something isn't right in those woods. Some stories date back to the 1970s. Others claim that the government knows about it and is keeping it a secret. The Collier family no longer talks about it publicly. Darren keeps the broken window frame in his garage. Mia still wakes up at night in a cold sweat. Lily sleeps with the light on. Tyler refuses to ever go camping again. He still remembers that hand reaching inside. Whatever visited their cabin that night wasn't there for food. It came to test them, to see if they would run away, and when they didn't, it nearly tore the cabin to pieces trying to get inside. It wasn't a bear. On that, they all agree. There was also another situation. A hunting trip was supposed to be a reunion of old friends. 4 men gathered deep in the San Juan Mountains in Colorado and set up camp a few miles from the nearest trail, in a secluded valley known for its moose, black bears, and silence. It was late October, cold and crisp. They brought rifles, tents, and plenty of stories. No one expected the weekend to end in death. Only 3 survived. The 4th man, Michael Mika Travers, was found the next day, battered, torn to pieces, and abandoned in a way no predator would ever leave its prey. The official story was that it was a mountain lion, but the others knew the truth. They had seen that creature, and whatever it was, it certainly wasn't a cat. According to reports, they arrived on Friday morning. Mick organized this trip. He was a sturdy man, broad-shouldered, bearded, and never afraid of anything. He was joined by James Lowe, Rick Simmons, and Luis Ortega. For decades, they had set up camp all over the West, hunting moose and deer. This place was new to them. Mick found it thanks to a local who warned them that experienced hunters were prohibited from entering the area. Mick just laughed it off. They walked 7 miles with full backpacks and gear. The campsite was ideal. Level ground, tall trees, and a cool stream nearby. They pitched 2 tents, built a fire pit, and hung their food high up. The first night passed without incident. A few distant hoots from owls, the rustling of the wind in the treetops. Nothing out of the ordinary. On the second night, everything changed. Around 1 o'clock in the morning, James heard a noise, a heavy, persistent crunching in the leaves. He assumed it was a bear. He grabbed his rifle and quietly went outside. The moon was shining and the forest was silent. And then he saw it 20 yards away, behind a tree, something standing upright. Broad shoulders, no neck. Arms reaching almost to the knees, covered in black fur. James froze. The figure didn't move. It just stared, then retreated into the trees and vanished without a sound. The next morning, James didn't say a word. He didn't want to be the one to tell stories about the snowman, but the very next night, they all saw it. Around midnight, something struck Rick's tent. A loud thud, like a thrown rock or a fist. Then a second thud, even harder. The tent buckled inward. He bolted outside with his rifle in hand, shouting to the others. Everyone came out, half-dressed and armed. The campfire was almost out. Behind it, 30 feet away, stood a creature, at least 8 feet tall, with thick, matted fur. The light from the fire reflected in its eyes, glowing with an amber sheen. Not a sound. Only breathing, deep and slow. Then it let out a low growl. Not a roar, not a scream. A sustained sound, like a warning. Mick raised his rifle. The creature vanished into the bushes before he could take aim. They stayed awake until dawn. None of them said much. In the morning, Mick insisted on staying out to hunt, saying it could have been a prank or a bear standing on its hind legs. James and Rick argued that they should leave. Louis was undecided. But in the end, they all stayed because none of them wanted to split up. That day, they split up to hunt. Mick headed north, deeper into the forest. He was supposed to check in by radio every hour. At 3:30 p.m., he checked in. At 4:30 p.m., he didn't. By 5 p.m., the sun had disappeared behind the mountain ridges. Louis and Rick set out to look for him. They found his trail and then signs of a struggle. Broken branches, deep scratches. Then they saw blood. They followed the trail for 100 yards until it ended. No drag marks, no footprints. They returned to camp and called for help on the emergency radio. But night fell quickly, and with it came the creature. At 11 o'clock at night, it attacked again. The creature leaped out from behind the trees and immediately pounced on James, throwing him 10 feet away and breaking his collarbone. Lewis opened fire and hit it once in the chest. It stumbled, growled, and vanished into the woods. They grabbed James and ran, without any gear or rifles, just the clothes on their backs and a headlamp. By morning, they had reached the forester's cabin. The authorities began a search and found Mike the next day. He was hanging from a tree 20 feet up. His body was torn to pieces, his arms were broken, his chest was crushed, and his jaw was dislocated. One of his legs was missing. All of his gear had been stolen. The radio was smashed. There were no animal tracks nearby, no bear tracks, no claw marks. The autopsy revealed that the cause of death was injuries characteristic of an attack by a large predator. The official report once again blamed a puma, citing its aggressive behavior after hibernation. But pumas do not break bones in this way. They do not drag bodies up into trees. They do not tear open tents or stalk people for 2 nights. Most surprisingly, photos of Mike's wounds were never released, as is usually the case. 2 days after the incident, the area was closed to visitors. What was the reason? I was shocked. The unstable terrain due to recent rains. Local residents didn't believe this explanation, and one of the rangers, speaking on condition of anonymity, told a local newspaper that things were much worse than they were making them out to be. James, Rick, and Lewis gave their statements, but they were told not to speculate, and no one believed them anyway. Some sources claim that the National Park Service covered up the truth, while others assert that the government knows something about those forests and wants to keep it a secret. None of the men ever returned to the forest. Louis sold all his gear. Rick moved to Florida. James still goes to therapy sessions because of his nightmares. They no longer talk about it in public, but each of them swore that what they saw was not a bear. It walked like a human, moved like a predator, and wanted them to leave. The elementary school in Oak Ridge, Oregon, stood right on the edge of the forest. It was a small town with one main street, a grocery store, and a quiet community that rarely made the news. But on the morning of February 6th, 2025, something happened behind the school that changed everything. The children screamed and the staff ran for their lives. And although no one was hurt, what they saw haunted everyone who witnessed it. It happened right after recess began at 10:15. After a week of rain, the sun had come out. 20 children scattered among the swings, slides, and climbing structures on the playground. Miss Harper, a 28-year-old teaching assistant, stood at the edge of the asphalt, drinking coffee and watching the children. At first, nothing out of the ordinary was noticeable. Then, from behind the trees growing behind the playground, a flock of birds flew out, quickly and in all directions. The noise was sudden and sharp. Some of the children looked up. One girl, Brielle, froze in her tracks. She pointed toward the row of trees. Miss Harper turned around and dropped her cup. Something enormous was standing among the trees. It was neither a person nor a bear. It was too tall, too still, covered in dark brown fur. Its shoulders were broader than those of any man she had ever seen. Its arms reached almost to its knees. Its face was partially hidden in shadow, but its two eyes reflected the sunlight. It stood silently, motionless, watching the playground, then took a step forward. Its movement was slow but confident. Its footsteps made no sound on the wet leaves. It didn't stagger or stoop. It walked straight, like a human, but heavier, more measured. It moved from one tree to another, then disappeared behind a tree trunk. The children began to scream. One teacher ran out into the street, while another dragged the children back into the building. Miss Harper stood rooted to the spot until one of the students grabbed her by the arm. Finally, she moved, leading everyone inside. Someone set off the fire alarm. Chaos ensued. A few minutes later, the police arrived. The officers searched the area, went into the woods with their rifles, and returned empty-handed. They reported finding broken branches, disturbed undergrowth, and a strange smell reminiscent of a wet dog and musk. Despite the muddy ground, no traces were found. No predator, no intruder, nothing. The school remained closed for the rest of the day. Parents were called. Some refused to let their children return to school. Brielle, who was only 7 years old, didn't say a word for 2 days. In her drawing, which depicted what she had seen, there was a tall, monkey-like creature standing by a tree. The tree's eyes were glowing. She said it never blinked once. Miss Harper gave her testimony. She said it wasn't a bear. It wasn't any kind of animal. She knew how it stood, how it moved. It was intelligent and observant. She said it seemed to her as if it were studying them. This part was never confirmed. The official report stated that it was most likely a black bear that had been disturbed by recent construction work behind the school grounds. The county had cleared a mile of forest to the east for new housing, and officials said the animal might have ventured closer to town than usual. But no bear behaves that way. No bear watches silently from behind the trees and then vanishes without a trace. And no bear makes children describe hands with fingers that are too long and a face that is half human, half gorilla-like. Several teachers began whispering among themselves. A janitor said that a few weeks ago he'd seen something tall in the woods but hadn't thought much of it. Another teacher said that during her morning walks, her dog refused to go near the edge of the forest. The previous month, strange cries had been heard, but they were attributed to coyotes. I later found out that a week after the incident, a man from the county arrived with a tablet. He interviewed teachers, students, and staff. Then he left. The principal stated that this man worked for the Department of Wildlife, but no one had seen him before, and he did not present any identification. After that, everything went quiet. Classes resumed at the school. New lighting was installed along the rear perimeter. The surveillance cameras were upgraded. The children were not allowed outside in bad weather. Parents discussed transferring their children to another school. A month later, a group of local hunters discovered a moose carcass half a mile from the school. It had been torn to pieces, its ribs broken, its spine unnaturally twisted, and its body wedged between two trees as if it had been thrown there. There were no bullet wounds or signs of a predator's attack. Only evidence of brute force. The discovery was reported to the authorities, but they claimed that the carcass had likely been torn apart by several predators. But the locals weren't so sure. For many years, they had heard stories about what was happening in the forest, about silhouettes flickering on the edge of visibility, about cries that were neither animal nor human. Most people didn't think much of it until this creature appeared behind the school. Some say it was just curious. Others believe it was a warning to them. Others believe it had been watching them for a long time and finally allowed itself to be seen. The children who saw it have never forgotten. Neither has Miss Harper. A month later, she left town. She said she couldn't sleep knowing it was still there, until someone told the truth. Whatever was standing at the edge of that forest that day didn't run away. It didn't hide. It came close. Close enough to be seen, close enough to terrify 20 children. And then it vanished. Like a ghost, leaving nothing behind but broken branches and a deep, bone-chilling fear that still hangs over that playground. Ben Ward and Travis Keller had known each other since they were 12. Both had grown up in the dense pine forests of northern Idaho, where weekends meant hiking, hunting, or disappearing into the woods, which swallowed up sounds and never gave them back. At 23, they were still doing what they loved. They fished in remote streams, camped in forgotten ravines, testing their endurance against the indifference of nature. But their last trip together proved that the forest was home not only to animals and silence, but also to something entirely different, something that watched from the shadows and attacked without warning. On March 18, 2025, they packed a light load and set out early in the morning, heading for the Mallard-Larkins Pioneer area, a place they both knew from their old Boy Scout trips, a remote wilderness with deep valleys, dense forests, and steep ridges. Travis was the better marksman, always calm and accurate with his bolt-action rifle, while Ben was the skilled tracker, able to read the tracks on the ground like lines in a book. They planned to stay for 3 nights, enough time to track down a moose or, if they were lucky, spot a cougar, but only one of them returned. The first day went smoothly. The hike turned out to be more difficult than they remembered. Melting snow had turned some sections of the trail into thick mud, but by late evening, they had set up camp on a flat hill above the valley floor. They pitched a small dome tent, built a campfire, and cooked jerky with beans, while the wind whistled softly through the trees, carrying with it the faint scent of wet pine and cold stone. Nothing seemed out of the ordinary, but something was already watching them. On the second night, everything began to change. Around midnight, Ben woke up to a strange sound. Slow, deep breathing, heavy and moist, not far from the tent. Too rhythmic to be the wind, and too deliberate to be random. He whispered Travis's name and they both froze, hearts pounding, ears straining. Whatever it was, it circled them once and then vanished into the woods without breaking a single branch. Its retreat was strangely quiet for something so heavy. That morning, Ben noticed disturbed leaves and large indentations in the moss around the camp. Signs that didn't fit the overall picture, as if something had been standing there for a long time, remaining out of sight, and had left no traces one would expect from any ordinary creature. They spent most of the day exploring the southern ridge, trying to shake off the strange feeling that lingered from the previous night, until shortly before sunset, Travis suddenly stopped and pointed to a clearing. There, half hidden by the trees, stood a figure. Broad, tall, motionless. Ben only caught a fleeting glimpse of it before it vanished into the bushes, but Travis swore that it had been watching them. He said it was neither a bear nor a human, and that its movements were unlike those of any animal he had ever seen. It was then that he first mentioned wanting to leave. Ben, trying to keep a level head, said they should wait one more night. At 2 minutes to 12, the attack began without warning. Something struck the side wall of the tent with such force that one of the walls collapsed completely, snapping the support pole, and both men flinched, grabbing their rifles and boots. Travis unzipped the entrance, and it was then that he saw her clearly for the first time, standing less than 20 feet away from them in the pale light of the last embers of their campfire. A massive figure, wrapped in dark, matted fur, with shoulders so broad they nearly filled the gap between the trees, and eyes in which a dim red glow burned, a glow that seemed too intelligent, too focused. His face was broad and flat, his nose flattened like a monkey's, but there was something almost human about his forehead and mouth, distorted, malicious, and full of hatred. Before any of them could fire, it lunged forward. Ben pulled the trigger and fired once. The shot echoed through the trees like a clap of thunder, but the creature barely flinched. It let out a roar, not the growl or cry of an animal, but a low, vibrating howl that sent a chill through Ben's bones and made his stomach clench into an icy knot. And then it lunged forward, tearing through the tent as if it were paper, while Travis dashed into the darkness, shouting at Ben to run. Ben followed him. His heart was pounding so loudly that he couldn't hear anything else, and he fought his way through the thicket in a panic until, as he descended the slope 100 yards, Travis's voice suddenly cut off with a sharp scream, followed by the sound of snapping branches and something heavy falling. Ben stopped, turned around and shouted, but silence reigned once more in the woods. No movement, no response. He searched for over an hour, circling the area and shouting, until he found Travis's torn backpack at the edge of a ravine. Lying nearby was his rifle, its barrel bent in half as if twisted by something powerful. There were streaks of blood on the tree trunk and splatters on the ground, scattered in a wide arc, but no drag marks, no footprints, and no sign of a body. It was as if Travis had been grabbed and carried away. Frightened and trembling, Ben decided to leave before it returned. He ran several miles in the dark, stumbling and falling, until he reached an old logging road and finally activated the emergency GPS on his radio. The next morning, a search party was dispatched. They found what Ben had described: torn gear, blood, signs of a struggle. but no predator, no remains, and no clear trail to follow. Several members of the search party noted that massive branches had been snapped high up in the trees, at a height inaccessible to either a human or a bear. Others said they smelled a foul, musky odor, almost like a mixture of wet fur and rot. Nevertheless, the official report cited a probable encounter with a cougar, and the case was closed when the search ended 9 days later. Ben's account was not officially disputed, but no one believed him. In fact, he said that the creature that carried Travis away walked like a human, but moved at a speed far beyond human capabilities. He said there was neither fear nor confusion in its eyes, only the cold calculation of a predator that knew exactly what it was doing. Some said he was in shock, in a state of psychological trauma. Others accused him of abandoning his friend, but Ben stuck to his story even when it was tearing him apart. He hasn't been back to the woods since. He sold his rifles. He moved in with his sister. Now, he hardly talks to anyone. But if you ask him what he saw, he'll say the same thing every time. There's something out there, something whose existence no one wants to acknowledge. It leaves no tracks, like a normal animal. It doesn't kill to eat, it kills to destroy. Whatever took Travis, it didn't make a mistake. It wanted him specifically.